Some inheritances come wrapped in silk and sealed with gratitude. Others arrive draped in silence, scented with secrets the dead never meant to keep. In a house where every folded napkin told a lie and justice came steeped in irony, one woman's legacy became the weight of a dozen betrayals. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. There are only 3 people on Earth who can make Nero Wolfe blink before 11 a.m., and 2 of them are dead. The third is Fritz Brenner, chef, housekeeper, and culinary conscience of the brownstone. So when he stepped into the office, wiping his hands on a towel and looking like his souffle had collapsed out of grief, I knew I was about to lose something. Time, most likely. Dignity, certainly. "Archie," he said with the sorrow of a man asking you to drown a kitten. "My cousin Ernst, he is in trouble." The trouble, as it turned out, was a dinner party on Fifth Avenue where Ernst, a freelance waiter with a herniated sense of punctuality, had double-booked himself. And Fritz, dear manipulative Fritz, had promised I would fill in. I reminded Fritz that I hadn't carried a tray since the Hoover administration and had no desire to wear a bow tie among people who called each other darling before twisting the knife. But Wolfe, seated in his chair with a book on Byzantine diplomacy, merely grunted, "Go." And that, as they say, was that. The Van Hastert townhouse was the kind of place where ghosts wore tuxedos and the wallpaper cost more than a car. Fifth Avenue, 3 flights up, 2 silent servants at the door, and an aura of old money that had turned brittle at the edges. Inside it smelled like orchids and anxiety. A butler, with the expression of a particularly stern obelisk, handed me a white jacket and nodded toward the dining room with all the warmth of a court summons. I slipped into the role, adjusted my bow tie, and reminded myself not to answer any philosophical questions about the wine. The table sparkled with enough crystal to start a war, silver spoons aligned with geometric precision. One chair stood empty, as though it knew better. The air buzzed, not with conversation, but with something that passed for it, the kind of talk you do when you're afraid to say anything real. I took my station against the wall, blending in like an obedient ghost. But I watched. I always watch. And what I saw that night would lead eventually to murder. Though at the time, all I noticed was that no one reached for the salt, and everyone flinched when someone else did. Pamela Van Hastert, seated at the head of the table, had the kind of beauty that had learned to weaponize stillness. She spoke softly, smiled rarely, and watched everyone with the vague interest of someone cataloguing symptoms. Her brother Julian, on the other hand, smirked like he'd invented sarcasm and was still charging royalties. Across from him sat Evelyn, the youngest, pale and restless, her fingers curling and uncurling around the stem of her glass like she was trying to strangle a thought. You didn't have to be a genius to know that this family hadn't hosted dinners for the pleasure of each other's company in a long, long time. Pamela offered toasts with clipped grace, Julian rolled his eyes just enough to be noticed, and Evelyn answered questions 2 beats late, as though her mind was always running 5 blocks behind. They laughed at each other's jokes like they were checking boxes on a form. And through it all, there was a kind of choreography, a careful dance of not touching nerves that were clearly dying to be touched. They looked like a family, seated together. They sounded like a jury about to vote on who gets thrown to the wolves. I noticed it the second course in a small, precise square of linen, folded like an origami secret and resting untouched beside Pamela's plate. She didn't dab her mouth with it, didn't adjust it, didn't seem to want to breathe near it, but she looked at it. Again and again her eyes flicked to it like it might unfold itself and spill something no one wanted to see. I've seen people eye diamonds with less intensity. She wasn't nervous exactly, she was too controlled for that. But the napkin meant something. And if there's one thing I've learned working for Wolfe, it's that meaning doesn't need volume. It needs silence. When the dessert came out, she reached for her fork, but not the napkin. and when Reginald Yates made a joke about the dead never staying buried, her hand twitched toward it before retreating. She was afraid of that napkin, and whatever was folded into it, it wasn't starch. Reginald Yates didn't walk into a room so much as declaim into it. He had the smile of a man who charged by the minute and the tone of someone confident you couldn't afford to argue. If Pamela was ice and Julian was static, Yates was noise. He made a few remarks about European tax codes that no one asked for, corrected the wine steward on the temperature of the Bordeaux, and complimented Evelyn on her dress in a way that made Julian's jaw flex. A family lawyer, they called him, but it was clear he thought he was something more, puppet master perhaps, or referee, or executioner, depending on the evening. He talked too much and said too little, except when he looked at Pamela and let the silence do it for him. When the third glass was filled and the last course cleared, Yates stood to light a cigarette and gave a little speech about family legacies. He never finished it. It was just after the digestive, a smooth French brandy that smelled like burned velvet, when the silence was cut in two. A gunshot, sharp, close, unmistakable. The kind that still echoes even after everyone's gone quiet. Yates had excused himself to the hallway, something about needing air. He never came back. Instead, the butler returned, pale enough to be mistaken for the brandy decanter. "Sir," he whispered to no one and everyone, "Mr. Yates has fallen." I followed the shiver of movement toward the corridor. Yates was sprawled face up on the parquet, one hand still curled like it had been holding a thought. His eyes were open. His mouth was not. Somewhere beneath his ribs, a dark bloom spread across his shirt, seeping into silk. Pamela gasped, but didn't rise. Julian swore and did. Evelyn stood like someone who had just remembered how legs worked. No one screamed, not really. It was a room full of people trained to emote in moderation. But the air had changed. The housekeeper dialed the police with trembling fingers. Someone checked the doors. And someone else, someone quiet, moved to the dining room and removed something small and white from beside a wine glass. The napkin was gone. While the guests gathered in horrified huddles and the staff fanned out to perform ineffective miracles, I drifted toward the service stairs like a well-trained shadow. No one noticed. No one asked. It was the kind of night where people forgot to remember faces. I stepped out into the alley and let the cold hit me. My instincts weren't playing coy. Something about this was already wrong, and the napkin wasn't the half of it. I caught a cab, kept my mouth shut, and pointed it uptown. Wolfe would be awake, and I had something that would ruin his digestion. Wolfe was precisely where I left him, in the big chair, slippered and sullen, halfway through a plate of calf's brains with béarnaise and a book on Sumerian land deeds. He didn't look up. "You smell like lemon, grease, and guilt," he said. "Remove yourself from the carpet." "I bring news," I said, shedding the jacket like it owed me money. "Unless it involves the imminent collapse of civilization or the death of a chicken, it can wait." "It's murder, Wolfe." He sighed, set down his fork, and finally looked up. "That," he said, "is hardly news." Who this time? I gave him the rundown, straight and lean, with only the faintest garnish of editorial spice. He listened, chewed, swallowed, and dabbed his mouth with the kind of napkin that doesn't go missing after gunshots. When I got to the part about Pamela's fixation and the vanished square of linen, he paused. "Describe it." I did. Fold, placement, timing, the whole nine. He frowned, not dramatically, just a small contraction near the eye, but from Wolfe that's a fire alarm. "Interesting," he murmured, which, coming from him, is just north of panic. And somewhere in that folded silence, the case began. It was 10:15 in the morning, which by Wolfen standards is somewhere between sacrilege and riot, when the bell rang. I had just settled in with the mail when Fritz buzzed up and said, "There's a woman, she insists." She wasn't just a woman. She was the kind that used silence like a brooch and lipstick like a contract. Pamela Van Hastert, in a black coat too sharp for mourning and sunglasses that tried too hard to pretend they weren't hiding anything, stood in the vestibule like she had nowhere else to be and hated it. I opened the door. "You've been here before?" I said, neutrally. "I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe," she answered, voice low and brittle. She didn't remove the glasses. I showed her in. Wolfe was in the office, reading a horticultural journal and trying to pretend that the world didn't exist unless it bloomed. He looked up, saw her, and frowned like someone had brought in an undercooked egg. "Madam," he said, "you are unannounced, and my disposition is not improved by surprises." She stood straighter. "This isn't a surprise to me." Wolfe snorted. "That would be your misfortune." I sat down. I already knew this wasn't going to be about breakfast. "I don't want to make this official," she said, staying on her feet. "I only need to know what you saw, what your man saw." That got me, not the wording. I'd been called Wolfe's man, his ferret, and once, memorably, his snare. But the tone. She wasn't fishing, she was cracking ice. Wolfe folded his hands across his stomach like a barrister preparing a reprimand. "Miss Van Hastert, I employ Mr. Goodwin at a considerable wage, not because he offers conjecture to strangers, but because he does not. If you are unwilling to engage our services in the proper manner, you are wasting both your time and mine." Pamela tilted her head, revealing just a slice of cheekbone behind the lens. "You were there, Mr. Goodwin. You saw the napkin." "I saw a lot of napkins," I said mildly. "Most of them came with soup." Wolfe grunted. "Enough. Either state your business with the requisite clarity or leave. I do not barter in hesitation." Pamela hesitated. Then she reached into her bag and didn't take anything out. "I'm sorry," she said. I thought, never mind. And just like that, she turned toward the door. Wolfe shut his eyes and picked up his book again. I followed her out, partly for decorum, mostly for instinct. She moved like someone used to control, the kind that doesn't sweat, just delegates discomfort. When we reached the steps, I said, "For the record, you didn't say much." She paused. The glasses stayed on. Her hand toyed with the clasp of her handbag, just for a second. Not nervously, reflexively, like a pianist brushing keys without meaning to. Then she looked toward the avenue. "No," she said, "but sometimes it's better if no one does." And she walked off, the perfume trailing behind her. Not sweet, not floral. Dry. Like paper that's been folded too many times. I watched her go, filed the detail away, and closed the door behind me. Back in the office, Wolfe didn't ask what she said, and I didn't tell him. Some things don't need saying. Not yet. By early afternoon, the air had shifted, and not just because Fritz had started a veal reduction. The door rattled open without ceremony, and Inspector Kramer stormed in like he'd just learned civility was a form of sabotage. "Goodwin," he barked, "you were there." "Where?" "Don't play. The Van Hastert townhouse. You served the oysters." Wolfe, who had been reading a monograph on Greek citrus, didn't look up. "Archie," he murmured, "if you must provoke the man, do it more economically." Kramer turned toward Wolfe. "You knew your operative was present at a crime scene and didn't report it?" "He was there under false pretenses," Wolfe replied, serene. "At the behest of a cousin of Fritz Brenner, he was not operating in my interest, nor yours." "That's not the point." "The point," Wolfe said, eyes finally lifting, "is whether any law was broken." Kramer glared at me. "You should have come in." "Inspector," I said, "I came home. That's our jurisdiction." He scowled, then looked between us. "You're hiding something. You always are." Wolfe gestured toward the door. "Do see yourself out before the veal suffers." Kramer didn't slam the door, but only because he knew it wouldn't matter. The door clicked shut, and I let out a low breath, not because Kramer scared me, but because I knew we had just bought ourselves more attention than we wanted. "You enjoy baiting him?" Wolfe said, not a question. "Not enjoy, appreciate. He gets predictable when he's mad. Do not mistake predictable for harmless. He will return." "No doubt," I said. "But until then we've got breathing room." Wolfe made a sound that might have been agreement or indigestion. "You think she'll come back?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just picked up his book again and turned the page with the gravity of a man re-entering a world that didn't involve folded napkins, vanished maids, or police detectives with poor manners. I took the cue and returned to my desk. It was the same old dance. Wolfe led with silence, and I followed with suspicion. Somehow we never missed a step. I gave Wolfe half an hour to commune with Citrus, and then slipped into research mode. Not for his benefit, he hadn't asked, but for mine. Something about Pamela's visit and Kramer's steam whistle routine had activated the itch behind my ears. The late Reginald Yates had been more than a family lawyer. He was executor to a trust fund so large it had required amendments, subclauses, and, rumour had it, a vault. The Van Hastert fortune, old and respectable, had grown bloated with wartime steel investments and post-war real estate. According to the filings, the trust was divided equally, on paper. In practice, the distribution required a yearly review and sign-off from Yates, and disputes were to be resolved at his sole discretion, meaning he held the reins and he could tighten them whenever he liked. Pamela had motive to fear him. Julian had reason to resent him. Evelyn, from what I could gather, had been cut out of most decisions entirely. I wrote it all down in Wolfe's casebook under the heading Motive, though I didn't say it aloud. If Wolfe wanted to ask, he would. If he didn't, well, I'd keep turning over stones anyway. It arrived around 7, just as Fritz was preparing trout meunière, and Wolfe was muttering about the misuse of lemon zest in popular cuisine. No knock, no bell, just the faint scrape of paper on tile in the breeze of a departing step. An envelope. No return address. Thick, expensive. Inside a single linen napkin, precisely folded, impossibly clean, and perfumed faintly with something that didn't belong to detergent, cologne, or polite society. I brought it to Wolfe, who took it between 2 fingers like it might bleed. He sniffed once. "Gardenia oil," he murmured. "Not worn, applied mortuary," I guessed. He didn't answer, but his eyes narrowed by a fraction. Enough for me to know the thought had stuck. The napkin itself bore no markings, no initials, no embroidery, but it was folded identically to the one Pamela had guarded during dinner. Not just similar, identical. The creases were deliberate, like a message written without ink. "Someone wants us watching," I said. "No," Wolfe said. "Someone wants us remembering." He handed it back to me and turned to the window, thinking in silence. The trout would be ready in 7 minutes, but the scent would linger much longer than that. Wolfe's rejection was not a theatrical gesture. It didn't involve exclamation, dismissal, or outrage. He simply folded his hands on the curve of his stomach and said, "No." I had just finished relaying the particulars of Pamela's vanished napkin, Kramer's most recent eruption, and the envelope scented with gardenia oil, any of which, in a normal household, might be enough to rouse interest. But Wolfe was not of that breed. "I will not pursue a matter that has not been offered with terms of engagement," he said, "nor shall I pretend that culinary linen, however fragranced, constitutes sufficient impetus. You do recall there was a murder? Yes, regrettable. But if police procedure has been impaired by linen, I am not duty-bound to unwrinkle it." I tried again. Yates was involved with a trust. Evelyn's inheritance is complicated. Pamela's silence is loaded. Someone sent us a napkin like they wanted us to bite. "That may be," he said, eyes drifting back to his book. "But unless the napkin was wrapped around foie gras, I remain disinterested." I stood. "Fine, you ignore the lightning. I'll go walk in the storm." He didn't look up, but I heard him breathe deeper. the sound he makes when he's not interested, only calculating. The Van Hastert townhouse didn't seem surprised to see me again. It was the kind of place that expected repeat visitors, the kind with cameras, warrants, or scandals. I rang the bell with the professional cheer of a man who had brought trouble in his pocket and a notebook for flavour. The butler opened the door with the blank civility of a man who had once worked for royalty and considered the Van Hasterts a demotion. I introduced myself as a reporter for an unnamed publication interested in estate succession, domestic architecture, and modern grief. That got me a blink, but he let me in. Inside, the same scent: leather, lilac, faint mildew, and unresolved tension. The dining room had been reset but not repurposed. It still felt like a stage after the curtain. I poked around, made notes that meant nothing, and waited for the staff to drift past like nervous smoke. One of the maids, a girl not old enough to remember pre-war cocktails, brushed by with a tray of empty glasses and a look that begged not to be noticed. I noticed, and when I asked her where Lillian was, she flinched like I'd struck a bell. "She left," she whispered. "No notice. Just gone." In the kitchen, I found another maid, older, sharper, with the kind of face that looked carved by secrets. I gave her the same question, with a little more pressure. "Where was Lillian?" She stared at me, hard and straight. "She left," she repeated. "Didn't say why, just didn't show up." No phone call, no message. A shrug. She was odd, quiet. "But careful," I said. "Did she always take her napkin with her?" That got me a pause. "I saw her clear plates," the maid said slowly. "But not her own." I leaned against the pantry door. "You're sure?" "I don't know what I saw. It was a strange night." I asked about the table settings casually. Who folded the napkins? Who set the plates? All routine, she claimed. No one touched Lillian's place but Lillian. Another girl, the youngest, finally broke. "It was still there when they called for help," she blurted. "Then it wasn't." And there it was, a napkin, present at the time of murder, missing before the cops arrived, and last associated with a maid who had now disappeared. I left the kitchen with my notes and a stomach that had started to twist. Something about the silence in that house didn't feel like grief, it felt like agreement. Pamela received me in the upstairs sitting room, legs crossed, cigarette unlit, and demeanour ironed crisp. She said she was surprised to see me again. I told her surprise was the most overrated emotion in the catalogue. I asked how she was managing. She said she wasn't managing anything. I believed her. She gave me careful non-answers about Yates. I asked whether he had enemies. She offered the usual abstract list: greed, pressure, envy, but not names. I asked about Lillian. Her face shut tighter than a sealed envelope. Julian appeared halfway through, reeking of impatience and the kind of cologne that tries to sell charm and ends up delivering suspicion. He asked if we were done snooping. I said I hadn't even started. "What happened that night wasn't random," I said. "Someone knew where the cracks were." "Cracks?" he repeated. "We're not a dam." "You're certainly leaking." He left, muttering something about lawyers and bloodsuckers. Evelyn was last. She stood in the hallway, pale and motionless. I asked if she wanted to speak. She nodded, then didn't. And still it said more than anything her siblings had tried. The truth was in that house under polished wood and old rugs, but no one wanted it opened, not yet. Wolfe was in the plant rooms when I returned, buried up to his elbows in sphagnum moss and judgment. I gave him the summary while he pinched the tip of a Miltonia like he was interrogating it. He didn't speak for a full minute. Finally, Van Hastert's staff are complicit in silence. The siblings are fractured by inheritance and resentment, and the maid is now a corpse in waiting. "Cheerful?" I said. "You want a drink?" "No." "You want to talk to any of them?" "No." "You want to keep pretending this is none of our business?" He turned a leaf. "It isn't." I left him there, half in shadow, half in denial. But he'd listened. He always did. And even as he stroked a delicate blossom with reverence, I knew his mind had turned toward the napkin, the silence, and the girl who didn't speak. Not interested? Number just not ready to say so. The call came at 10:30 that night from a precinct clerk with a voice like cardboard. A body had been found in Central Park off the footpath near West 74th. Female, mid-20s, strangled, no ID, name suspected, Lillian. I didn't ask how they guessed. I went down. I shouldn't have. She was laid out on the grass like someone had posed her for something. Not a crime scene, not a funeral, more like a warning. The napkin was tucked into the waistband of her apron, neatly folded, gardenia scented. No blood, no signs of struggle, just silence. I stood there longer than I meant to. When I got back to the brownstone, I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Wolfe looked up from his desk, saw my face, and closed the book in his hand. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply nodded once and sent Fritz to warm brandy. It was just past midnight when he called me back into the office. Wolfe was seated behind his desk, palms together, chin resting lightly on the tips of his fingers. The globe was dark, the room was still, and the smell of gardenia had followed me all the way from the park. He didn't gesture, he didn't clear his throat, he simply said it. The phrase that meant the waiting was over. This has become my concern. I didn't smile, I didn't speak, I just sat down in the red chair, picked up a pen, and opened the notebook. Because once Wolfe decides the game has begun, it never ends in a draw. The Van Hastets came like summoned chess pieces, which in a way they were. Wolfe had requested their presence by note, not invitation, and all three had arrived within 15 minutes of one another. Either that spoke to tight familial coordination or three separate agendas with equally desperate timing. They took their seats facing Wolfe, who remained in his chair like a man refusing to taste an undercooked dish. Pamela was composed, Julian was restless, and Evelyn looked like she was waiting for permission to breathe. Wolfe regarded them as if he were passing a wine list, slowly, thoroughly, and with deep disappointment. "I thank you for your punctuality," he said. "It is a courtesy often neglected, even in murder." Julian's jaw tensed. "Are we being accused?" Wolfe didn't answer. He merely leaned back and let the silence do the bruising. "You called us here," Pamela said evenly. "For what, exactly?" "To observe," Wolfe said, "to listen, and perhaps, eventually, to answer." No one moved, and in that stillness I recognized Wolfe's real strategy. He wasn't interrogating them. He was watching to see who would break their own rhythm first. It didn't take long. Pamela broke the stillness with surgical timing, aiming her blade squarely at her brother. "If you want to talk about motive, let's begin with Julian's plan to dissolve the trust." Julian stiffened. "I wanted clarity. That's not a crime." "You wanted control," she replied, crisp and cold. "You always have." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Miss Van Hastet, I asked for observation, not confession." Evelyn blinked and looked down at her shoes. Julian leaned forward. Yates was meddling in things that didn't concern him. He made decisions behind our backs. He was Pamela's man, always was. Pamela smiled without warmth. "Because I was the only one willing to read what the lawyers put in front of us." "Because you needed him," Julian snapped. God knows why. Wolfe didn't interrupt. He let the tension thicken, like stock on a low simmer. "What about Evelyn?" Julian said suddenly. "She's the one no one talks about. That's how it always works. She slips through unnoticed. Maybe she finally decided not to." Evelyn jerked her head up, not in denial, but in alarm. Her mouth opened, then closed. Wolfe turned slightly. And what precisely would she have decided? No one answered. Not even Evelyn. But the silence had changed. It wasn't passive anymore. Evelyn Van Hastert had perfected the art of invisibility. During most of the exchange, she sat folded in her chair like pressed linen, uncreased, unmoved, and unspoken. But Wolfe, having spent a lifetime deciphering human reticence, had no intention of letting her performance pass unmarked. "You do not speak," he said gently, like a man identifying a weakness in a souffle. "That does not mean you are not speaking." Evelyn glanced at him, startled. Wolfe's gaze did not waver. "Silence, when strategic, is a kind of authorship." "I have nothing to say," she murmured. "Then you are in the minority," he said, "and perhaps the only one worth listening to." She looked at me then, quickly, and then away, as if she had seen something in my face she couldn't afford to remember. That was all. But I had the distinct sense that if we ever got to the bottom of this, Evelyn's silence would be the rope holding it together, or the blade that had cut it. Wolfe didn't need to tell me to follow Chester Brain. He merely said, "Our next avenue, Archie, wears cologne and commissions." Brain was the Van Hastert family's financial advisor, with the teeth of a man who never bit his nails and a suit too tight for modesty. I'd seen his type before, low-stakes charm with high-stakes access, men who carried numbers like confessions and smiled like they'd already signed your will. He left his office at 3 and strolled downtown like the avenue owed him royalties. I followed from a polite distance, resisting the urge to walk faster just to avoid his cologne. Something herbal, sharp, and at war with itself. He stopped at a flower shop, browsed, and didn't buy. Then ducked into a side street and slipped through the door of a small building with a plaque that read, "Private Nursing Services." I waited 15 minutes. When he came out, he wasn't alone. The woman with him was older, limping slightly, her coat collar pulled high. I recognized her. So did Brain. He said something to her. She flinched. Then he walked away without looking back. Whatever that conversation was, it wasn't financial. It was damage control. I caught her outside the coffee shop on 83rd, where she'd retreated with the kind of posture that says, "No one is watching," and she's grateful for it. I introduced myself politely, and she said, "I know who you are." She was the Van Hastert's former live-in nurse, dismissed 2 months prior for reasons no one had written down. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said. I told her I wasn't asking that. She sipped her coffee like it might run away. He asked if I remembered the letter. "What letter?" "The one from the mother, before she died. She had Reginald write it. He folded it in a napkin. Told me not to look." "Did you?" Her pause was a confession. It was about the trust, changing it. Not in Julian's favor. "Why are you scared?" She turned her arm slightly. Beneath her sleeve, a yellowing bruise bloomed like old ink. "I fell," she said quickly. "It's nothing." It wasn't nothing. It never is. When I left, she gripped her coffee cup with both hands like it might tell her what to do next. And I walked back to the brownstone with a fresh note in my book, and Wolfe's voice already forming the next step. Wolfe was unusually quiet when I recounted the exchange with the nurse. Not dismissive, which would have been routine, but contemplative, which was worse. "She is frightened," he said. "That's generous." It is clinical." The bruise was fresh. "About 4 days, maybe 5. He leaned back. Then he visited her before Pamela's death, and perhaps before Lillian's. He drummed his fingers once, then reached for the dictaphone. "Archie, take this to the Times." I blinked. "We're placing an ad?" "Indeed," I typed as he dictated. "To Lillian, concerning the matter of missing property, we understand. Contact discreetly, nothing will be pursued. All is forgivable. Signed, a letter L." When I finished, he sat with closed eyes. "What's the play?" I asked. "We wait," he said, "and we observe. Whoever believes Lillian left behind something dangerous will reveal themselves, either in curiosity or in panic." "Nice net," I said. Wolfe grunted. "Number it is a whisper, a pebble dropped in shallow water." And if no one takes the bait, he opened his eyes, then we try something louder. It happened just past 2, when the brownstone was as still as Wolfe ever allowed. The orchids were slumbering. Fritz was in his quarters. I was reading halfway through a paragraph when the sound came. Subtle, quick, decisive. The door to Wolfe's office, opening. No light, no voice, just movement. I waited a beat, then stepped into the hallway in socks. The silhouette was bent over Wolfe's desk, not rummaging, not searching. It went straight to the drawer, the one where the napkin had been placed, the folded one. I flipped the switch. The figure turned, startled. Not armed, just desperate. They ran, I let them. There's a kind of theatre to panic that leaves better fingerprints than a slap. When Wolfe came in, robed, frowning, I told him everything. He nodded once. Then it matters, and it matters enough to risk exposure. Still think the napkin's irrelevant? He looked at the drawer. No, he said. Now I think it's sacred. She arrived wet from the rain, pale enough to rival porcelain, and hollow-eyed like someone who had been outrun by their own thoughts. Evelyn Van Haster didn't ring. She drifted in. I opened the door before she touched it. For a moment, she just stood there, lips parted, but no sound coming. The collar of her coat was soaked. Her hands trembled, not dramatically, just enough that you knew she hadn't chosen to come. She'd been driven here by something larger than fear. She opened her mouth. "Julian did it," she said. Then her knees gave out like someone had cut the strings, and I caught her before she hit the tile. Wolfe, summoned by my voice, appeared in the office doorway. He took in the scene, the collapsed girl, the soaked coat, the dropped handbag, and his face went still, not with concern, but with professional interest. "Archie," he said, "get Fritz." I didn't need to. Fritz was already there, towel in hand, eyes widened slightly. "She's ill?" Wolfe asked. "No," I said. "She's spoken." He raised an eyebrow. That would be a novelty in this case. And with that he turned back to the office, leaving us to handle the storm that had arrived in human form. Fritz took charge with the calm of a man who's nursed both consommé and crisis into proper form. He guided Evelyn upstairs, murmuring something soft and German-flavoured, and returned minutes later with her coat and a whisper of concern around his eyes. "She is resting," he said. Wolfe had resumed his seat, a volume of Cicero open, but ignored on his lap. "Resting," he repeated. "Is she in possession of her faculties?" "She knew where she was, but she's unwell." Wolfe grunted. "If she is fit to name her brother as a murderer, she is fit to speak with the police." "She collapsed, Nero," I said. "You saw it." "I saw dramatics. I did not see a diagnosis." He closed the book without marking the page, which told me more than anything else. He was troubled, not emotionally. Wolfe left that to lesser species, but intellectually. "She said Julian did it," I repeated. Wolfe's voice was dry. "Then let's see who else she condemns once she's conscious." Inspector Kramer didn't knock. He announced his entrance with the sharp staccato of angry souls against oak, his overcoat still damp and his mood forecasted as thunder. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Good afternoon, Inspector," Wolfe said from behind his desk without rising. "Fritz, a chair." Kramer ignored both civility and seating. "You've got Evelyn Van Haster upstairs. Don't insult my time by denying it." "I rarely insult what's already beneath its station," Wolfe replied smoothly. "She's a witness. She may be a suspect. You don't get to hide her." "She is neither under arrest nor formally sought," Wolfe said. "She arrived uninvited, unfit for questioning, and is under no obligation to perform at your tempo." Kramer's jaw tightened. "You're obstructing." Wolfe sniffed. "You're improvising." I sat back and watched the tide rise. It was a familiar dance. Wolfe, serene and immovable. Kramer, boiling with purpose. They respected each other in the way artillery respects stone walls. With frustration. "I will get a warrant," Kramer growled. Wolfe lifted his chin. "Do, and while you're at it, Inquire whether compassion now qualifies as contempt. Fritz hovered, uncertain. I cleared my throat. I'll make coffee, I said. It wasn't diplomacy, it was defense. I should haul you in, Kramer said. His voice had dropped a notch, quieter now, which meant worse. Wolfe didn't look up from his desk blotter. Inspector, your circulation is far too reactive. I would recommend hawthorn and restraint. You're harboring a witness in a murder investigation. I am sheltering a frightened girl who, as you've pointed out, may be a suspect. Until she is medically cleared to be interrogated, I will not subject her to further trauma. That's not your call. Then make yours, and do so quickly, or we'll be reading about your coronary before I finish my lunch. Kramer stared at him like he wanted to reach across the desk and throttle him, but Wolfe had this way of freezing a room, of reducing even rage to the level of a puzzle. Kramer swore once, muttered something about procedure, and left with a slamming door that tried too hard. Wolfe exhaled. Such vigor. I'll add Hawthorne to the shopping list, I said. He didn't answer. But the mood had shifted, and Wolfe was no longer pretending to be aloof. Julian Van Hastert didn't strike me as a man who worried about his wardrobe, but that morning he made a discreet visit to a midtown tailor with the kind of precision that suggested guilt or vanity, possibly both. I followed at a distance, which wasn't hard. Julian walked like a man who assumed the sidewalk would part for him. The tailor's shop was respectable, the sort that catered to inherited wealth trying to dress like earned cash. Inside, he spoke in low tones, handed off a garment bag, and emerged with a newly pressed suit over his arm. I waited 20 minutes, then doubled back, flashed the janitor a 20 and a smile, and asked about discarded items. The back room smelled like mothballs and ambition. A bin of cast-off garments offered me what I wanted: Julian's old suit, folded poorly, stained faintly, and still warm enough to prove it hadn't been there long. I didn't need Wolfe's nose to detect blood. Not a pool, but a hint, darkened into the fabric like a secret that wouldn't come clean. Back at the brownstone, I dropped it on Wolfe's desk like a silent accusation. He didn't ask where I got it. He just reached for his magnifying glass. It was Wolfe who found it, tucked into the inner lining of the jacket, half torn and folded small enough to be mistaken for lint. He unfolded it with the care of a priest handling ashes. A florist's receipt, top half gone, bottom half intact. Just a few words, but enough. The napkin to me, or the past comes out. Wolfe read it once, twice, then again. Then he handed it to me like it was cursed. It's her handwriting, I said. Pamela's. Yes. And that's not a request. No, he said. It's an ultimatum. The tone was unmistakable, not pleading, not even threatening, just final, the kind of tone you use when you've lived with too many secrets and suddenly realize you want to die with one less. Who was she sending it to? I asked. Not Julian, Wolfe murmured. He already knew, and not Evelyn. She lacked the initiative. Brain? Wolfe shook his head. Too cautious. He tapped the paper. Number this was meant for the one who still had access to the past, the one who could still open coffins and count signatures. I stared at the paper again. The ink had smeared near the bottom, but not from water, from blood. The phone rang just as Wolfe finished refolding the note, his fingers unusually still. Fritz answered, listened, and handed it off with a face that warned what was coming. Wolfe took it. Yes. A pause, then quieter. When? He replaced the receiver with something close to reverence. Pamela Van Hastert, he said. Found in her bedroom, apparent suicide. I felt my stomach tighten. Apparent? Too clean, too composed. And? She held a napkin, folded. That was all. No more, no less. Just linen in the hand of a dead woman. A symbol, a signature, a farewell, or a final accusation and written in cloth. The napkin had been sitting in the drawer for 3 days, untouched, unsmudged, and undiscussed. Wolfe, like most men who rely on the sensory world in moderation, had ignored it in favor of more urgent abstractions. But that morning, without preamble, he asked me to bring it to him. He took it from my hand like it might bite, held it 6 inches from his face, and inhaled. "Not perfume," he said. "Not cologne." He folded it, unfolded it, then brought it closer again. "Gardenia oil." I sat. "Popular with no one since 1948, save for stage actresses and morticians." "Charming company." Wolfe frowned. "It is used not as a fragrance, but as a masking agent. Gardenia oil neutralizes antiseptic odors." He stood, not fully, just enough to reach the dictionary volume labeled funerary. "The practice is rare. It is employed by mortuaries to scent burial cloths, particularly when placing personal effects with the deceased." "You think someone buried a napkin with Mama Van Hastert?" "I think," he said, "that the scent is not symbolic. It is logistical." His voice dropped. "And someone has attempted to exhume memory by removing the very cloth that kept it quiet." I went alone. Wolfe's feet were as committed to the brownstone as his theories were to logic. The Van Hastert's chosen mortuary was tucked between a Lutheran church and a bakery, a pairing that offered both transcendence and cinnamon rolls. The funeral director was a thin man with the brows of a villain in a Victorian serial and the voice of a sleep-deprived auctioneer. His name was Emery Greb, and he remembered the Van Hasterts well. "Refined people," he said, with reverence bordering on salesmanship. "Particular. The kind of family that wants the shoes polished even if the casket's closed." I mentioned Reginald Yates. Greb nodded. "Oh yes, he came in personally, very solemn. Said the matriarch had left instructions. Not formal, mind you, but heartfelt. A letter and something else." "What else?" "A cloth, folded, neat. Said it was sentimental." He offered this with the enthusiasm of a man recalling a memorable invoice. "You placed it in the coffin?" "Of course," he insisted. "Tucked in with the hands." "And the letter?" "Sealed. Private." He smiled. "You'd be surprised how often that happens. Families like to keep things in the ground." I thanked him and left. The air smelled faintly of lilies, but under it I thought I caught a trace of something else. Gardenia. It wasn't often I walked into the brownstone feeling like I needed a drink stronger than Fritz's coffee, but I came close that day. Wolfe looked up from his beer-battered flounder with one eyebrow already half-armed. "He remembered," I said. Wolfe didn't speak, not a word, not a grunt, just waited. "Yates brought in a sealed letter and a folded napkin," I continued. "Said it was on the matriarch's request. The mortician placed them both in the coffin." Wolfe leaned back. "Folded." "Deliberately." "And the letter?" "Delivered by Yates, prompted by Pamela." Now he nodded, which suggests awareness, not of content perhaps, but of meaning. "Pamela wanted something buried," I said, "but not lost." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Precisely. She did not burn it. She interred it." "Like a seed." "Or a confession." He closed his eyes for a beat. "We must retrieve it." "You're suggesting an exhumation?" "I am suggesting a correction. The past is misfiled. It must be reopened." He looked at me. "Make arrangements." I did, not gladly, but thoroughly, and I made sure the letter from the city clerk included the phrase "Wolfe wanted" typed in bold. For purposes of clarification, he said the dead don't mind paperwork. I wasn't convinced. It rained. Of course it rained. If the city clerk hadn't signed off, I would have taken the weather as a divine protest. But bureaucracy, like Wolfe, is indifferent to atmosphere. The cemetery was tasteful, the grounds immaculate, and the mood somewhere between morbid and municipal. I oversaw the proceedings while Wolfe remained dry and dignified, tucked back at the edge of the canopy like a philosopher at a butcher's window. The coffin emerged with ceremony. The lid was opened with tools that looked too crude for the task. And there she was, Madame Van Haster, preserved in the way only money and chemicals can achieve. But the hands were empty. No envelope. No napkin. Not even a crease in the burial cloth to suggest they had once been there. Wolfe didn't speak for several minutes. Finally, "Theft at the grave." Crude, I nodded. Who knew it was there? Yates, Pamela, possibly the undertaker. And now it's gone. He looked down at the coffin. Number not gone, moved. What do you want to do? He turned toward the car. Think and feed, in that order. And as the coffin lowered back into the earth, I felt a strange sense that something living had just passed below. Not the dead, but the truth. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe sat in his chair with a glass of milk and the silence of a man who had been proven correct in the worst way. The napkin was real, he said. Its scent, its fold, its placement. The scent was intentional. Its absence now is equally intentional. The letter? Gone, stolen, or never buried. He looked at me. If the latter, Pamela lied. If the former, someone anticipated its rediscovery. That narrows it, yes, and heightens the danger. He tapped his fingers. Pamela had the letter. She passed it to Yates. Yates ensured it reached the coffin, or claimed to. Now both are dead, and the only physical proof of its existence is the scent lingering on a napkin left in my drawer, which someone tried to steal. Because, he said, it confirms a trail. To what? Wolfe smiled thinly. To the true distribution of wealth, to motive, to a will unseen but understood. That napkin didn't matter because of what it held. It mattered because of where it had been. And the letter? Contained the reason 3 people are now dead. That was his verdict. Not offered with drama, but with certainty. Fritz brought in tea, Darjeeling, strong, no lemon, and a plate of buttered toast which Wolfe accepted as if it were an oracular rite. I sat across from him, flipping through my notes. The napkin is the thread, he said. It connects a sequence of concealments. 1 cloth, 1 scent, 3 deaths. I chewed my toast. All because a woman wanted to change her will. No, Wolfe said, because she succeeded. Then why bury the proof? Because her family wasn't ready. He sipped, eyes narrowing. The letter disinherited someone. Pamela knew, Yates knew, Lillian discovered it, and now they're gone. I exhaled. So who benefits now? Ah, Wolfe said, the question every tragedy dines upon. And he closed his napkin slowly, as if the linen might still whisper the answer. Wolfe summoned me to his desk, where a list lay already prepared, names, time, place. Invite them, he said, all of them, the heirs, the handler, the nurse, and Kramer, of course. I raised an eyebrow. You planning a play? He gave me a look that suggested offense at understatement. I'm planning a conclusion. To dinner? To deception. He reached for the bell. Fritz will prepare something ceremonial, light, but final. Dessert? No, Wolfe said, reckoning. And then, with a nod that carried the gravity of a curtain's rise, the dinner is served. There's a particular stillness that creeps into the brownstone when Wolfe prepares for final movement. It isn't exactly suspense. That's too emotional. And it isn't tension, either. It's more like a gravity shift. Something subtle but weighty, like the air realizing it's about to be cross-examined. Wolfe was in the office early. That is to say, 10 minutes before the appointed time. He wore his black waistcoat, the one he reserves for funerals, high indignation, and what he calls the administration of personal justice. His expression was unreadable, which from him is as transparent as it gets. Archie, he said, align the chairs. I did. 3 on the left, 2 on the right, plus 1 at an angle. The geometry was intentional and not merely for comfort. He looked them over and gave a small grunt of approval. This will suffice. I didn't ask what for. The chairs would fill soon enough. Heirs, suspects, witnesses, and Kramer. The cast of a tragedy, summoned to Wolfe's courtroom without benefit of jury or mercy. He reached for a notepad and wrote a name. At the top, in block letters, Julian. He didn't speak again until the doorbell rang. But in his silence, the verdict had already begun to form. Pamela's death cast a strange pall over the assembled. Not grief, that would have required intimacy, but a sort of embarrassed silence, as if the family name had been caught in a compromising position. Evelyn came first, hands clasped, expression blank. Julian followed 10 minutes later, jaw tight and eyes sharper than usual. Chester Brain slithered in behind them with the cautious confidence of a man unsure whether he was the audience or the accused. Wolfe didn't rise. He gestured them to their places and waited until they were seated before speaking. "You are here," he said. "Not because I have the authority to compel you, but because someone here has exhausted the luxury of a mission." No one moved. He shifted his weight. "You have all lied, by commission, by silence, or by performance. The time for that has concluded." Julian leaned back. "This is ridiculous." "Not at all," Wolfe said. "It is inevitable." He fixed his gaze on Brain. "Mr. Brain, you received a letter from Pamela Van Hastet 3 weeks ago regarding the trust restructuring. You ignored it." Brain opened his mouth, then closed it. "Ignore this one," Wolfe said softly, "and I will have Kramer invite you to repeat the mistake under oath." The air had cooled. And Wolfe hadn't even begun. Evelyn Van Hastet had said almost nothing since the meeting began. She sat with her back straight, her hands neatly folded in her lap, and the look of someone who had memorized how to appear smaller without disappearing. But Wolfe had noticed her, as he always did. "Miss Van Hastet," he said, "you have been silent for much of this." Too silent. She blinked. "I don't know what to say." "That," he replied, "is rarely true. Most people know what to say. What they struggle with is whether to say it aloud." Julian turned toward her. "She's not part of this." Wolfe raised a hand. "You are no longer permitted interruptions." He turned back to Evelyn. "You knew your mother's intentions. Perhaps not the contents of the letter, but its existence. You've been protecting someone." Her mouth opened, but he continued. "Not yourself. That much is clear. You've been protecting your brother." "And for what?" he asked gently. "To preserve the illusion that the family remained intact?" She looked down. "You were silent because you thought silence might save something," Wolfe said. "But silence, Miss Van Hastet, has killed 3 people." And now, at last, Evelyn began to cry. Wolfe waited until Evelyn's hands had stilled before continuing. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate, the tempo of a man turning keys in ancient locks. "The letter," he said, "was dictated by the Van Hastet matriarch 6 months before her death. It revoked equal inheritance and appointed Pamela as sole beneficiary of the estate." Chester Brain's mouth twitched. Julian's did not. "Reginald Yates, as executor, received the letter. He obeyed the matriarch's instructions, but chose not to file it until he could confirm Pamela's willingness to bear the burden. He buried it, literally, per her request." Wolfe looked at Julian. "You discovered its existence." Julian stared at him, a thin smile forming. "You have no proof." "I have Pamela's copy of the trust revisions. She never filed them, but she kept them." He nodded toward me, and I handed Julian a sealed envelope, retrieved from Pamela's bedroom, slipped behind a drawer, folded but not torn. Wolfe continued. "Pamela didn't destroy the evidence. She preserved it, and when she learned the grave had been disturbed, she knew the truth was no longer sleeping." Julian's hands twitched, and for the first time that morning he did not interrupt, which, from him, was as good as confession. Wolfe exhaled once, a quiet breath, measured, not weary. Then he continued. "Reginald Yates was the first to die, shot in the hallway of the Van Hastet home. The timing was convenient. His control over the trust was intact, his silence suddenly necessary. He had become a liability to the person who had most to lose from Pamela's ascendance. He didn't name Julian yet, but his eyes rested on him. Then came Lillian, Wolfe went on, a housemaid, a quiet one, but not stupid. She noticed the missing napkin. She mentioned it to someone, that someone warned her off. She persisted, and for that she died. Julian shifted in his seat. And then Pamela. Her death was meant to echo despair. The staging was meticulous. The placement of the napkin in her hand, folded as before, was a calculated cruelty. It was not suicide, it was statement, or rather a fabrication of one. He leaned forward. The napkin connects each death, the same fold, the same scent. Gardenia oil, not incidental, but deliberate, applied before burial, preserved through time, and handled by a killer who believed symbolism was a substitute for subtlety. Julian opened his mouth. "Don't," Wolfe said. "You've touched them, and we have the one you failed to steal." I retrieved the napkin from the drawer, gloved, bagged, and quietly damning. "You left a trace," Wolfe said, "on the cloth, on the suit, and in the wake of every death." The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was waiting. Wolfe gestured, and I stepped forward with the evidence. Not dramatic, no gasps, no drawn breaths, just the slow unfolding of inevitability. "This," I said, "was recovered from the trash bin of Julian Van Hastert's tailor. Discarded the morning after Evelyn collapsed in our doorway." Kramer stepped forward, took the sealed bag, and inspected it with a nod. "There's blood," I added. "Faint, but traceable. Belonging to Lillian, possibly transferred during disposal. We'll let your lab confirm." Julian didn't look at me. He looked at Wolfe. Wolfe smiled, just enough to be insulting. "And," Wolfe said, "we have the note. Torn, partially burned, recovered from the inside pocket." He held up the florist's slip. "The bottom line still visible. Bring the napkin to me, or the pass comes out." Wolfe let the line hang. Then gently, he placed the final piece on the desk, the gardenia-scented napkin. "Handled only by you," he said. "And Pamela?" Julian said nothing, but he didn't have to. His silence had changed again. It wasn't defense, it was collapse. Kramer moved, slow and purposeful, like a man walking into weather he'd already predicted. "Julian Van Hastert," he said. "You're under arrest for the murders of Reginald Yates, Lillian Marks, and Pamela Van Hastert." Julian didn't argue. He stood with a strange calm, his eyes locked not on Kramer but on Evelyn. She didn't look back. Wolfe remained still. I knew better than to expect satisfaction from him. For Wolfe, the unravelling of deceit was not pleasure. It was ritual. Julian allowed the cuffs without a word. Chester Brain exhaled in visible relief. Too visible, if you asked me. Kramer nodded once toward Wolfe. "You've done it again." Wolfe replied with only a small motion of his hand, as if brushing away a leaf. I saw it in Kramer's face. Resentment, yes, but something else too. Reluctant respect. The office emptied slowly. Truth had been served, which, in Wolfe's house, was usually just the first course. When the last footstep faded and Fritz retreated to the kitchen to recover his sense of peace, I turned to Wolfe. He had closed his eyes, but not in sleep. In reflection, a posture of contempt for the world's moral improvisation, I asked, "You satisfied?" He didn't answer at first. Then, "There is more poison in a family than in a kitchen." I nodded. He reached for his beer and took one sip. It must have been warm, but he didn't complain. Outside, the city was moving again, but inside the brownstone the air had cooled, and somewhere beneath the weight of linen and memory, the silence returned. But not untouched. Evelyn Van Hastert didn't come in with fanfare. No tears, no dramatics, no click of heels on the marble tile. Just a soft step, and the kind of silence you only get after a long siege, the kind that follows when the cannons have stopped, but the dust hasn't settled. She sat across from Wolfe's desk, not touching the envelope in her lap. It was already open. The legal phrasing inside had done its damage. "Well," I said, trying for casual. "Congratulations." She didn't smile. "It doesn't feel like that." Wolfe didn't move, didn't comment. He simply regarded her with the same gaze he gives to a mislabeled orchid. Not unkind, just correct. "It was supposed to be Pamela," Evelyn murmured. "She was better at all of it." "Inheritance," Wolfe said, "is not earned, Miss Van Hastet. It is endured." She looked up at him, startled by something in his tone. Maybe kindness, maybe truth. "It doesn't bring peace," she said. "No," Wolfe replied, "but occasionally it funds a pursuit of it." She nodded slowly. Then, with an unvoiced gratitude, she rose and left the room. Wolfe exhaled through his nose, and I folded the silence she left behind like paper. Sharp at the edges, impossible to smooth. Kramer arrived just before 6, which for him is either early evening or an unmarked olive branch. He had a manila folder in his hand, a thin one, the kind that says either the case is closed or that someone's trying very hard to look like it is. "I came for the statements," he said. Wolfe inclined his head a full quarter-inch. "You may take them." Kramer didn't sit. He rarely does, as if worried the cushions in our chairs might be bugged or scented with arrogance. He took the file I handed him and flipped through the pages with mechanical disinterest. "I'm not saying I like your methods," he muttered. "You've never needed to," Wolfe replied. Kramer sighed. "Still, you got there first." Again. There was a pause. Wolfe reached for his beer and took a sip, which is as close as he gets to a bow. Kramer eyed him, then me. "You should tell him someday what a pain in the neck he is." "I do," I said. "Twice daily." He almost smiled. Almost. Then with a grunt and a flick of the folder, he turned and left. Wolfe didn't watch him go. He was already thinking of dinner, which, in this household, is how we mark the close of war. At precisely 7, Fritz served squab in a raspberry glaze so subtle it bordered on suggestion. Alongside it came roasted fennel, parsnip puree, and a silence so orderly it could have passed inspection at West Point. Wolfe carved with the reverence of a man disassembling scripture. I let the first bite linger long enough to admit, silently, that the day had earned it. "Poetic justice?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Tastes like overcooked sauce." Wolfe didn't look up. "You exaggerate." "No, you see, I expected the ending to be sharper, a twist, maybe Julian throwing himself down a flight of moral stairs. The law, Mr. Goodwin, does not concern itself with theatricality." "Yeah, but we do, at least I do." He dabbed his mouth. "Your palate for resolution is too dependent on crescendo. Truth seldom ends in a crash. It decays." Fritz didn't speak. He rarely does when philosophy's in session, especially when it competes with his glaze. "Still," I said, "nice squab." "Acceptable," Wolfe allowed, which from him might as well be a standing ovation. The plates emptied, the wine did not. And somewhere between the burnt crust of the fennel and Wolfe's narrowed eyes, I realized we'd crossed from victory to digestion. That, in this house, is how we begin to let things go. The clinking had quieted, not gone entirely, but dulled like a conscience after a justified crime. Wolfe leaned back, the angle precise, his weight balanced just so. I took that as my opening. "So," I said, "was justice served?" He didn't answer immediately. That would have been too generous. Instead, he reached for the last roll, examined it, then set it back with faint disdain. "Justice," he said finally, "is not a portion. It is a source." I blinked. "Beg your pardon?" He waved a finger. "Listen, it can be bitter or sweet. It depends not only on the preparation, but on the tongue that receives it." So this was... what? A raspberry reduction with a touch of guilt? He frowned. "Sometimes it burns, sometimes it cools too quickly. But it is never the same, even with the same ingredients." I pushed my chair back. "And you still think you're not a philosopher?" "I am not. Philosophy seeks meaning. I impose order. That was Wolfe, all right, as allergic to abstraction as he was to stairs. And yet sometimes his truths hit harder than any headline. He closed his eyes, not in fatigue, but in refusal to waste thought where digestion had begun. I stood slowly. Something about his metaphor had lodged itself under my skin, and it wasn't done cooking. Fritz cleared the dishes with his usual monastic precision, his movements folding time as much as tablecloth. Wolfe had already vanished to his orchids, an act that always carried the theatrical finality of a judge leaving the bench. I remained behind, lingering like a footnote no one quite wanted to cite. On the table, beside my empty glass, sat the last napkin. It hadn't been used, not by Wolfe, not by me, not by Evelyn. It was just there, white, linen, and lightly creased, as if holding its breath. I picked it up, not out of habit, but something closer to instinct. There was a faint scent clinging to it. Gardenia, maybe, or something floral that had no business being in our dining room. Wolfe hadn't noticed, or maybe he had and chosen not to say. I folded it once, neatly, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Not theft, preservation. There are things a man keeps not because they're useful, but because they are proof that something was felt or feared or forgiven. The napkin had touched none of us, and that, I think, is what made it matter. I turned out the light. Some symbols don't ask to be interpreted. They just wait to be found. I crossed to the window. The street below was humming, the kind of mechanical lullaby only New York can manage. Taxis flickered past, pedestrians scurried like nouns searching for sentences, and somewhere a saxophone failed to convince the night it was worth saving. Wolfe's brownstone stood like a sealed book on a shelf full of pamphlets. Inside, we had solved a thing, turned its insides out, inspected the damage, folded it back. Outside, none of it mattered. Justice had been served, or reduced, or sautéed, depending on your metaphor of choice. But no one down there knew. No one looked up. No one paused. Truth doesn't echo in the city. It evaporates. A folded napkin, a line in a will, a scent that doesn't belong. They vanish here like breath on glass. And if you're not careful, you start believing that resolution is the same as peace. It isn't. I pressed my palm lightly against the pane. It was cool, indifferent. Down below, a woman dropped a package. No one helped. I stepped back. In this town, you can walk past a murder and forget it before lunch. You can inherit millions and still feel hollow. And you can fold a thing just once and never unfold it again. Some truths arrive not with thunder, but with the quiet rustle of linen folded once more. In the hush that follows justice, we are left to wonder which wounds belong to the living and which to the dead. Evelyn Van Hastert inherited more than a fortune that day. She inherited a silence carefully built by others and broken by a man too clever and too still to let it stand. Do you believe the burden of truth is lighter than the weight of a secret? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.